fairly short. Should we use the microphone? Yes. Okay. Thank you. So welcome to this first panel of the second day. I'm actually sorry I couldn't be with you yesterday, since I'm sure it was actually quite fruitful and it pretty much set the stage for what we are about to discuss in this first panel. Thank you very much for having me as moderator of this chair. My name is Jiglau. I do not have a name tag. I understand there has been there's a case about this. Someone has taken my name tag, but you can see my name there on the slide right at the bottom. I'm a member of the political science department at the Babeș-Bolyai University in Cluj, and I would say I don't know exactly who had the idea of having me to moderate this this panel, but it was a short bet because this is the kind of discussion that I thrive for. So I work a lot on. My main background is in comparative politics, but I work a lot on energy policy, for instance, on election studies, on electoral systems, party systems. But I would say that these are all rather in the sphere of consequences to the core issue that we are discussing today, which is democracy, democratization, and the ideas and values that support democracy, which I would say not just since we are talking about a war next door, but for a number of years, if not even decades, as a build-up to what we see nowadays, I would say this is the main issue, right? So to me, this is, as I said, the kind of discussion that I would never, ever dare to turn down. And it's a great privilege to have this position to moderate this panel today. So we have with us four excellent guests: Professor Gabriela Ciot, Professor Wojciech Michnik, Professor Adrian Pabst, Adam Reichardt. Thank you very much for being here. And without any other long introduction, I would give the floor to our first speaker, Professor Gabriela Ciot. I would ask the speakers to stick to 10, 12, 13, 14, 15 minutes. Every once in a while, if you can, with the edge of your eye, look at me so that I can wave if you should hurry. And then after these initial remarks, which should probably take about half of the panel, we would open the floor to questions. I would not insist too much on my own questions, though those might come up too, but rather on your own questions. So let's begin.
Thank you, Professor Jiglau. I'm honored to be here. I would like to thanks to the organizer for making this event possible, and special thanks goes to my colleague, Dr. Radu Albu, with whom we are sharing the same scientific interests in the field of international relations, and especially international and European negotiations. So we had to prepare some answers to some questions because our moderator sent us before some materials to be studied, and I'm trying to give some answers. So the answers to the questions of the present discussions refers to the pathways, means, and instruments of interactions of contemporary world, and not to ways of interactions between the actors of international system. So I'm referring to the state and non-state actors, of course. When we are talking about the international system, we have to take into consideration the aspects of power within the system, which the international actors release or want to present. Being about democracy and technocracy, the question that we had to raise is which are the conditions that favor the appearance of autocratic governing system which have a certain attitude toward power in the system. If we are speaking about democracy in the age of Putin, mean that we are putting on the first place autocracy to the detriment of democracy. And I am not willing to give this period the characteristic of the so-called Putin era. There is an indisputable autocracy. What is happening in the rest of the world, starting from east to the west then? Why do illiberal elements and autocratic tendencies appear in the West, and how to claim democracy in the East against the backdrop of autocracy? Didn't Joe Biden says that the most important thing is the power of example, or more important is showing the example? And speaking of technocracy and epistocracy, to what extent epistemic groups do not become instruments of idiocracy, respectively, to create useful idiots for different expressions of domestic or international power? So here we should also return to the classic role of epistemic communities, that of laboratories for perspective thinking and offering alternative strategies, and not for justifying current or immediately following decisions. And the dream of technocracy is a perversion of the trend introduced in the international decision-making process a century ago by the Woodrow Wilson, to use expertise for knowledge and not to use technologies, called technocracies, in the management of international public interactions. The apostles of globalization have recently become proponents of deglobalization, but without explaining what this deglobalization means. And they don't explain because they don't know that the globalization process meant multiple levels of interdependence and integration, phenomena that they cannot deny for the present or for the future. Therefore, it must be noted that the elements related to climate change, the Green Project, require partnerships, not only at the state level, but also between states and corporations. That strategic partnerships are over 3 decades old in international relations, but in most cases, they are maintained at the declarative level or on the old formula or on national security interest. And now these partnerships too manage not only militaristic formulas of the all types of alliances and coalitions, but integrative programs from economic and social to political, military, and even cultural. And partnerships are built and maintained through permanent negotiations. Very few current states have noticed this phenomenon, and they still do not have the capacity to interact efficiently at the regional and global level. Therefore, we believe that there is a need for a rethinking of the way of understanding international relations or international politics, but also of the ways and means by which a world of peace and prosperity can be built, as the politician says. For the time being, we note the advance of the group of states and corporations which support the so-called economic nationalism as a justification of a medieval type of sovereignty aimed only at the interest of the narrow instrumentation of power. But let's have an eye on the EU and its current stance, and let's just try to see which is the impact of the war from Ukraine for the European recovery. Since the war in Ukraine began, economic growth projections for Europe have been revised down and inflation estimates ratcheted up. Most recent forecasts, which take into account heightened uncertainty and shocks to commodity prices, suggest that the real gross domestic product growth in the European Union could fall well below 3% in 2022, down by more than 1.3 percentage points compared to estimates before the war. Further supply chain disruptions and economic sanctions are likely to push the European economy into recession. Higher food and energy prices will hit households in the European Union, especially poorer ones. Ukraine and Russia are major suppliers of energy and agricultural products. As the war damages production capacities, the price of many core products that are difficult to substitute will rise. Inflation triggered by the war could reduce real private consumption in the European Union by 1.1% in 2022, although the impact will vary across countries. The impact will be felt more in countries where consumption is more sensitive to energy and food prices, and where a relative large share of the population is at risk of poverty. Countries in Central and Southeastern Europe tend to be more affected. EU firms were weakened during the COVID-19 crisis, especially smaller ones. Their ability to withstand the withdrawal of policy support was already uncertain. The war will exacerbate firms' vulnerability through three channels. The first one, a reduction in exports, the second, lower profit due to higher energy prices, and the third one, difficulty finding funding as banks avoid risk. Firm-level simulations conducted by the European Investment Bank suggest the proportion of firms losing money will increase from 8 to 15 in 1 year, and that the share of firms at risk of default will rise from 10 to 17 over the same period. Chemicals and pharmaceutical, transport and food and agriculture are the sectors hardest hit. Firms in countries closer to Ukraine and Russia, such as Hungary, Poland, Latvia, and Lithuania, will feel the pressure. Moreover, firms in Greece, Croatia, and Spain will also be more affected than the EU average. The impacts on banks should remain contained, but firms' access to external sources of finances may worsen. Overall, the European banking system has little direct exposure to Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus, except for a handful of banks. However, these banks have shored up their capital buffer sufficiently to withstand the write-down of some of their assets in Ukraine and Russia. Despite that, credit standards have started to tighten, especially in Central, Eastern, and Southeastern Europe region. The finances of EU member states will likely deteriorate. Spending could rise as countries host refugees, implement redistributive measures to help households cope with energy prices increases, and increase military spending. Revenue is also likely to be lower than planned given the slowdown in economic activity. Overall, budgets are expected to be most affected in EU members neighboring Ukraine and the Baltics. But while I was looking on the reports from which I took the data that I presented, one episode of American history unfolded before my eyes. Almost 9 decades ago, Franklin Delano Roosevelt became the President of the United States. The country was in a similar position with today's European Union. More crises treated with short-term measures which favored the deepening and enlargement of it on different sectors. Just after his installation on the White House, President Roosevelt gave a 13-minute speech on which he diagnosed the disease of America, in what way and how it took it, what has to be done to get well, how long will the convalescence last, and which will be the costs for all categories of citizens. Immediately went into action involving the entire American society in the recovery process. I was thinking about this episode also during the pandemic, that because EU needs not only packages with measures to show that its institutions are working, but a clear vision integrated regarding the way on which we will proceed to recover economically and socially, following the several crises that we are facing for a few years, in order to work at the parameters required by the actual state and future evolution, and to become globally competitive and offer to its European citizens the prosperity resulted from a sustainable development. We all know that we cannot have results in 1 or 2 days. The analysts consider that a systemic transformation of the EU will request between 5 to 10 years of intense work, which will be very difficult for European politicians caught in the electoral fight. And from here, we have the huge need for European political leadership credibility, which are asking to prove through facts increased responsibility toward entire Europe. But one thing is clear, it is hard to be European these days. But today's international world reminds us constantly that the harmony and balance of international scene must be constantly maintained, and it can be built only through negotiation and cooperation. Understanding complex networks, multiple level, and anticipating the actions of various global and regional actors who make up these networks can be achieved through an in-depth knowledge of operating mechanisms and procedures, but above all, through the prism of the negotiation process in which they were engaged. complex interdependence, cooperation, partnership, and negotiation are the key concepts that describe the contemporary international system and that can strengthen the rules-based international order. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I think this is a very good introduction to the context in which we are living these days. Adam, please, your turn.
Thank you very much. And yes, once again, thank you to the organizers for the invitation to be here. And so far, I do think that the discussions and debates have been really very important, very deep. And I do appreciate the different perspectives that we've had. And I hope we can continue these debates today, throughout the day. And I do appreciate, Professor Ciot, your opening remarks, because you presented a lot of data, which is going to also be part of what I want to talk about. As you know, I'm not an academic, so my perspective is more from observations. I'm a journalist, as well as just what I have been covering around the topic of Central and Eastern Europe over the last 10 or so years. But I want to look at, I tentatively titled my point today is Populism is Not Dead Yet, and why that really matters now. And I want to just briefly go through a few ideas, and I hope we can draw it out more in the discussion. And first of all, I think I want to discuss this because this was a debate yesterday. So I want to give a little context of how I understand populism, because there was some debate about what populism means, and I think we know, I think we can agree that populism is not a well-defined term. If you look at how media covers populism, how academics cover populism, there is no real agreement in how populism can be understood. And in fact, when it came, or where it came from, or how we got here today, I think if we look at contemporary Central and Eastern European politics, populism definitely has arisen largely over the last 15, 20 years, since probably the turn of the century, the 21st century. We all know that after the fall of communism, Berlin Wall, and the Soviet Union, we were celebrating the end of history and the victory of liberal democracy, and that victory was short-lived, as other threats and other risks to democracy and our values, our democratic values, rose even just 10 or so years after that victory. So, we look at the transformation that took place in our region of Central and Eastern Europe, a transformation which was focused on a metamorphosis from a command economy under the communist period to a neoliberal, democratic one, and it was successful in many ways. A lot of the key goals were reached. The countries joined the European Union, they joined NATO, but then there were also other key areas which caused some problems, particularly in the social economic area. We've seen the growth of a middle class, but you also see the gap between the lower middle classes and the wealthy and upper classes, which were probably the main beneficiaries of the initial transformation. So we can think that this is a little bit of context of where populism came to rise in our region, and the question then leads to what is populism, and I want to kind of refer to Pippa Norris, who argues that populism should not be understood as a political ideology, and rather we should understand populism as a style of rhetoric, as a style of discourse. And in this way, all political parties can be populistic. And we've seen this actually in our region of Central and Eastern Europe, though I think we can agree that far right or right-wing parties are the ones who are probably the best at using populist methods, populist styles to mobilize their electorate. So Kirk Hawkins, he called this the ideational approach to populism, and he stated that the common discourse of populist parties and movements reveals a shared way of seeing the political world as a Manichaean struggle between the will of the common people and an evil, conspiring elite. These ideas expressed in the rhetoric of leaders and supporters have a real impact on politicians' behaviors and also policies. So in this way, populism, parties that use populist ideas really turn the world into black and white, simplification of complex situations, pitting the people who they define against the elite or the corrupt elite who they define. Yes. So we've seen this, of course, in Hungary in particular. We can just look at the example of George Soros, who has been number one enemy. He's the one who is, steering all of the problems, or even Brussels bureaucrats are considered the key evil for Viktor Orban. And we can see even in Poland, the Law and Justice government, which was elected in 2015, it was really the refugee crisis that was presented as the biggest threat at that time to Poland. So it was the government of Law and Justice which could come in and protect the Polish people. So you see a lot of this is focused on creating divisions, creating a division between two parts of the society. And this is how populism actually thrives, is through divisions. And this is, I think, one of the key threats to democracy is this polarization of society. And what I mean by this is that every society has been polarized since politics, since democracy. But what the key problem with populism and the polarization of that is that it's toxic, it's very negative, and the discourse becomes more and more aggressive. I don't want to say violent yet, because we don't really see much violence yet in democratic countries, but it's possible we get to that point. And here in this way, social media plays, but I would say mainly social media plays a really key role in this division of societies. And what's really important from my point of view is that when democratic societies are constantly divided, constantly polarized, thanks to these types of policies and politics, they become more accustomed to this, and they become more used to living in a polarized society, becoming more used to hearing how one person or one small group of people can solve all these complex problems for them. And this is, I think, a threat to democracy, in that it becomes more useful once, we see this already in many countries, once populists are in power. In order to maintain power, they still use populism, this rhetoric of divisions, to maintain their power. And they have to maintain their power in more non-democratic ways. So they use tools like propaganda, they use tools like racism, xenophobia, other types of ways that divide society in order for them to maintain power. And so I think, and as societies become more used to that, and then as political parties become more authoritarian, this is, as you mentioned, this authoritarian rise in many countries, they may become more. It may be easier for them to succumb to an authoritarian, even a soft authoritarian style of power. So I would say that's number one from my point of view. Number two is also, as you had already mentioned, regarding the crises that are coming. We know that crises in the recent past, because I would say if we go back into history, as was also mentioned, that crises can be used as a moment to rally around, to unite, to bridge societies together. And in the recent past, that has not been the case. We can look at the refugee crisis in 2015. We can look at the COVID-19 pandemic as well. This was a very divisive crisis. Fortunately, for a moment, Europe is united around Ukraine, the issue around Ukraine. And this is really key, because I do believe that the situation in the war in Ukraine is probably the most important event facing us in at least a generation, if not more. And we have been relatively united in our support for Ukraine because we understand what's at stake. However, as a result of the war in Ukraine, we know that there are going to be crises that are going to hit us as people, our societies. We've already talked about inflation, the economic indicators. We know that energy prices are going to go up as well. So this is going to start to create more fear in society, which is already in this polarized mentality, seeking easy answers to very complex problems, and maybe a new opportunity for populists to take advantage. And I think that this is what we really have to worry about. And on top of that, in order to amplify these different messages and these narratives, you have Russian propaganda behind it all, pushing for the division. And in some cases, we know that Russian propaganda doesn't even push for pro-Russian thinking. It even just wants to push for divisions. So we have to be really careful as a society. And we know this, of course. Everyone in this room knows what we're talking about. But to build resilience in societies takes time, and we are way behind. And unfortunately, it may even be too late if things go in the wrong direction. So I guess maybe I just, to conclude, I think that we need to understand how much of a risk and what faces us in the coming months. It's going to be really important that we find a way to stay united, particularly on Ukraine. And this would, I think, limit some of the impact of anti-democratic forces who are trying to take advantage of the situation. But imagine what happens if the crises get out of control. So we will be divided and weakened, certainly. And let's hope that our resilience will remain strong enough. So I do think, in addition to that, we have to talk more about the values that define us. We're here on the panel talking about democracy and values. So, looking at the values of freedom, human rights, human dignity, democracy, rule of law, and most of all, solidarity. And supporting Ukraine's fight against Russian imperialism, I think, aligns with all of these values. And this is the way we need to frame our support for Ukraine. So I do believe, in conclusion, I do believe that a Ukrainian victory would give new momentum to the spirit and ideas of these values and of democracy, not just in Ukraine, but in our countries as well. And that is why Ukraine's fight is our fight. But imagine a Russian victory in Ukraine. I think this would be catastrophic. And not only it would be a direct threat to our security, but at the same time, it will give a strong momentum to the anti-democratic and populist and illiberal forces that want to take power in these very difficult times. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. And let's not forget that some of the content that we have prepared, and that there is no time for all of it. Some of it will be, we can go back to it when we have questions, because I'm sure that there are many more things that each of us would feel like saying. Thank you for sticking to time. Wojciech, please.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, Ratio Foundation, for hosting us. Of course, thank you, Leon, Christopher, and all the LSE Ideas crew for basically starting the cooperation and what we hope to be a long-term project for us. And I will give you a couple of thoughts on the Polish foreign policy vis-a-vis some of the democratic values, of lack of those. Adam talked from the journalist perspective. I'm an academic, but I will talk more from the policy-oriented perspective with the some of the ideas that already been mentioned. So I will just go briefly with them. And I guess I'm the only sucker with the PowerPoint presentation today. Go figure it out. This is what military usually calls, the death by PowerPoint. And I hope if the death arrives, it will be swift and painless. So why don't we start? I have basically two ideas for this talk. First, to give you a reflection on the nexus of democratic values on one hand and foreign policy in the context, in the perspective of Poland. And the second one is a perspective. Remember, not the perspective. This is my perspective on the current state of Poland foreign policy, especially in the context of the Russia's war in Ukraine. And depending how you view the war, you might agree or strongly disagree with my views. Some of the things that I will say are not only, let's say, academic talk, it's also a concerned citizen talking. So there will be slight criticism of the establishment. And, just spoiler alert, I do not think that you can blame only one party for that. that goes, it's a long process. And at the very same time, since the title of the conference is Democracy in the Age of Putin, I do understand the title that, that Putin just basically is, another external threat, but we've already done damage to ourselves, those societies who backslided in terms of democracy and the rule of law. So it's very difficult to basically analyze it separately. Both external threat and internal is actually inseparable here. And I think this is something we already mentioned it during the panels yesterday. So the question for me is how Polish government basically used this war moment in February to escape the debate about this democratic backsliding. And of course, I argue that government escaped on two different levels, in Poland and also internationally. The debate right now comes back within the EU, but I think Polish government holds, at least for so far, very strong cards, and I will refer to it later in the course of my presentation. There are legal experts and lawyers here, so I will not pretend that I'm an expert on the rule of law, but I would argue that this is one of those elements of the stable democratic or liberal democratic system that is key, especially from the international point of view. I mean, how banks, international players are going to invest in the country that doesn't really abide to the rule of law. So basically, this is one of those issues that we have, in Poland. And democracy, we already discussed, rule of law, we already discussed. So some of those things I just can leave on hold for a moment and walk you through very quickly two narratives of how Poland succeeded or not succeeded over the last couple of years. Then we'll get to this moment, that Poland's success story was not treated as a success story anymore, but basically it was treated as a cautionary tale, that we were in Poland too happy too quickly. We left over too many people behind. This is what Adam actually was talking about. This is also a clash between values, the democratic values that societies like to at least, wear on their shoulder, and threats to their well-being. Threats presented by populists and also by sometimes ordinary citizens to the identity of the nation, to the threats from outside. And last but not least, in terms of the concepts we are talking about here, how Poland really traveled in a couple of weeks from almost pariah state, at least on the in the Western world, in the international institutions, mainly European Union, but also NATO, to what we call a frontline state and a hub necessary for supporting Ukraine in the war against Russia. And when I mentioned that, it's crucial for us to define what kind of war we are dealing with, is because if we define it, this is just another war. No offense to our Balkan friends, but if we define this is just another war somewhere on the outskirts of Europe, we'll treat conflict differently and what's happening differently. If we understand this war as an existential threat, not only to Ukraine as a sovereign nation, but also as a question of to be or not to be for the European Union, for the Western countries, stability and peace, that's a completely different understanding. And spoiler alert, from where I sit, I think it is an existential threat, and it is not only Ukrainians' war, it's also ours war. Whether there is a sense of urgency among Western societies is a different story. And I might not be in the best place to say it because, Romanians are very similar in their response to Ukraine, to war in Ukraine. But I would argue that farther the west you go in continental Europe, the consensus is not, at least, it's not there. It might be on some level of the political establishment, but societies are not that convinced that this is existential struggle. And if it's existential struggle, are we willing to put everything on the, on the table to win the war? So, I want to be, fine with the moderator. So the quick story, and I'm sure most of you, especially the Polish part of the audience, knows the success story of Poland. Mostly from the Western perspective, it's presented as the economic success story. And most likely, this is also why we witnessed this backlash. Because, the macro statistical data does not always tell you, what really happens in the households. And the division, the economic, social division between Poland A and Poland B at some point kicked in, which led not only to the populist parties going up, but also to the, in effect, the democracy backsliding. But I think also there's one factor that we often forget, especially in Poland. When you study as a kid in history in Poland, you get this idea, Polish democracy is a very long time project. The second written constitution in the world, then practices of democracy. So basically, once you come from the high school, you might have this idea that, well, we are well suited for being a well-established Western type democracy. But if you really count the years when Poland really practiced democracy, it's very few. And it gives you also the answer why we should not be surprised that the backsliding occurred. I would argue, if it occurs in well-established democracies like United Kingdom, I'm talking about the Brexit debate, but not only in the United States, with Trump, with polarization, it of course can happen in very young democracy. And this was, I think, the dream that some of the elites and some of the intellectual elites in Poland were dreaming, or that they were living the dream that we are so old in terms of democratic heritage that it will just be fine. But it wasn't. And of course, the falling from grace, kind of losing it, that perhaps started around 2014, 2015, was not accident. It should not come as a surprise. So where do we fit the foreign policy into this narrative? Again, for most of you, it will be obvious, but Poland, in terms of the approach to the outside world, it's been pro-Atlantist from the very beginning of the 1990s. Actually, if there is one consensus among political elites then, and even now, it's that it's a pro-Atlantic direction. But at the very same time, we witnessed for the at least last decade what we can call bilateralization of NATO, meaning Poland's playing and talking mostly to the United States, very often outside of the NATO context, which basically gave a headache to the people in Brussels. I'm talking about NATO headquarters. It also resulted in what some scholars called minilateralization of NATO. Kind of working in subgroups like Bucharest 9 or something that goes even outside of the NATO scope, which is, the idea of Free Seas Initiative, which, by the way, if it wasn't politicized, it wouldn't be that bad idea at all, if you ask me. Another factor, for us to understand the current complexities of Polish foreign policy is that basically, even though Polish system gives prime minister vast majority of powers to exercise foreign policy, it leaves some to the president. And what we've witnessed, at least for the last couple of years, especially, but not only under President Duda, is that president and president's office takes care about the United States and most of the security-oriented discussions, while leaving to Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs, let's say, the European playground. And this duality does not always play well with the international actors, and it also causes confusion both internally and externally. And last but not least, from the Polish foreign policy perspective, we can talk about three different dimensions of the war, Russian war in Ukraine. And I will not have time to discuss them all at length, but just to kind of put them there. The one is the military dimension, of course. The helping Ukrainians to fight the war. There is the refugee dimension, which right now we are not even yet conscious. What will be the repercussions? Whether there will be a constant flow of refugees later, whether those who came to Poland and other frontline states will stay or will live. Are we able to basically, provide them with being citizens, not secondary citizens, because that will create many problems in the long run. And the last one, the potential direct confrontation between Russia and NATO, because I know, that if we talked about it 2 years ago, it might be a science fiction scenario, but right now I don't think that, that there are any NATO states that don't calculate, those potential scenarios. So in those three dimensions, in terms of the Russian war in Ukraine, Polish foreign policy is kind of quite present. So, I just mentioned that Polish foreign policy is pro-Atlantist and basically, Euro-Atlantic. But, how much Euro is it? It's a different story. I mean, I gave you the very long quote from Prime Minister Morawiecki, from his famous or infamous piece in The Spectator this August. And I will not read what he said because I think you can see it, but basically, the anti-EU rhetoric is very obvious. Anti-German and French rhetoric is very obvious. And again, that's his, right to do it. But the question is, in terms of cohesion of Polish foreign policy, can we say one thing to the French and Germans during the NATO sessions, and then completely different things to them during the EU meetings? And it comes, of course, from this debate about the sanctions against Poland, that European Commission put on. Morawiecki, by the way, Prime Minister Morawiecki last week said that those sanctions are much more hurtful for Poland than EU sanctions imposed on Russia. So the rhetoric is there, and you can argue whether that's only for the domestic audience. I would be surprised if it was only the case, or whether it's just another manifestation of being kind of EU skeptical. Okay, so I'm almost done. So, from all those different ideas and concepts that I threw at you, what can we take? I mean, number one, this is my take. There is no substitute for liberal democracy and the rule of law. Unless there is a war and we can basically stop talking about it. And you can make a serious argument that the war, and since it's an existential threat, in the short term is much more important than our expert discussions about how much rule of law we have in Poland. So that's number one. But in the long term, I think it's very destructive. It will be very hard to go back to this discussion because we don't know how much war will last and whether we will be able actually to come back to, let's say, state before war in terms of democratic discussion. Again, the other one is, this existential struggle or ad hoc crisis, because again, if we only view the war, Russian war in Ukraine as an just ad hoc crisis, your reading of the situation will be completely different. And last but not least, and I will end here, is that we have within the European Union what I would call a Polish paradox, because on one hand, Poland right now, and this is the what I call saved by the war, Poland right now is a necessary actor for European Union to become what they called geopolitical actor. There is no way for EU to be regional power, not only to global power, if it doesn't do things together. I think the Economist article addressed it, that in order for EU to become global, it first to become local, meaning it has to take care of the business on its borders. It needs to take care of the war in Ukraine. And Poland is a necessary puzzle. You cannot just go by Poland. But on the other hand, also because if the rule of law is not really there, and if the democratic backsliding continues, Poland has a potential of destroying European Union. Because it's, and again, no offense to our Hungarian friends, it's not that, they are small and they do not matter, of course they do, but because of our size of the population and of the sheer power of politics and economy in the region, if Poland fails, I think the EU will crumble. So on this very optimistic note, thank you very much.
Don't worry, Wojciech. I think all speeches until now have been very optimistic. So thank you. And Adrian, please.
one that relies on the nurturing of virtue and character, both of all citizens, but above all of political leaders. Without more virtue and greater political popular participation, I think democracy is at great risk. And that is, I think, the main task for today.
Thank you to all four speakers. I think there's already a lot of content that has been put on the table, and as all four of you were speaking, I was wondering, I was trying to somehow extract some sort of synthetic thoughts to what you've been saying, but that's quite difficult because there is so much to discuss, and we're already beyond the halfway point of our panel. What I think nevertheless sticks, and I think this has come up as a common point to everything that you have said is, and let me start actually with the point that you have made in your conclusions, Adrian, the fact that democracy is in fact an ideal type, right? And as anything that is ideal, it is virtually impossible to be reached in reality. And I think much of the tension, let's say, that comes in the public debates about democracy in all our societies, in all our democratic societies where such debates are possible, much of this tension would be toned down if we start from this premise. Democracy is never perfect, and even more so, democracy is the kind of political regime that fosters its own vulnerabilities, its own demons, right? So under the spectrum of freedom of expression, which is again fundamental to and unquestionable to any democratic regime, you do see many of these ideas that contradict democracy itself or even try to take it down altogether being expressed, and up to a certain point, which again is a matter of debate, you need to let them be expressed, because otherwise, and whenever you try to draw a line, you see all these forces like literally coming out of the caves and trying to be extremely efficient in claiming the fact that their own freedom of expression is being hindered, which I think is a very interesting twist that we notice in almost all populist, modern day, maybe right-wing, some would say, populist discourses. And one other thing that I think is very important and has also come up in your speeches explicitly or implicitly is that those who threaten democracy or question it, and even proactively so, very often work with feelings, even if they do indeed resort to data, to numbers, to make their points, to such arguments that indeed they select in order to fit their own narrative. But they do twist this feelings dimension of the discourse in a very efficient way. And this is very often how they manage to win votes, first of all, but also how they manage to persist and expand their spectrum to areas of society which maybe at first were not within their reach, combined with the fact that what we call elites, democratic elites, so those who, for better or worse, are loyal to democracy, very often succeed in having a very bland discourse, right? And they simply believe that displaying expertise, and that's not always the case, of course, will make them be successful and counterbalance populist discourses. So one thing I would have in mind, and I'm interested in your thoughts here, because you have all spoke about leadership, elites, and that's an open question, and I would go in the same direction when answering. So if we need better elites, if we need better leadership, I would say when we phrase that, we actually acknowledge the fact that those that we have in place now do not do a job that is good enough, because this is how we end up having all these problems on the table, and this is how these dangerous discourses that we are discussing about manage to have material to work with. And to me personally, this is a failure mainly of political parties, because in a democracy, these are the main vehicles to recruit those that are pushed in public office, elected or appointed. So those that should, despite their ideological differences, which are normal, should work for the collective good in a way that preserve democracy on the long run. And this is what we failed to see in the last decades. So what do you think would be, maybe not a solution, because I don't think this panel will succeed in the next half hour to give solutions to these issues, but where should we look? I mean, do you think that alternatives to representative mechanisms that we see in place, political parties, elections, are those that might provide an answer? Because there are now arrangements, and we all know of them and maybe even interact with them with respect to deliberative democracy. Many such arrangements trying to be implemented at the local level because communities are somewhat smaller there. Are such solutions the key, something that we already maybe have in mind? Maybe are there new ways that we can think of, new mechanisms to recruit better elites? Could technology, because I think most of the points we have made about technology were rather in a negative way, let's say, okay, somewhat of a threat to democracy unless it's properly used, technology, but could it give a way for recruiting better elites? And finally, maybe, should we, instead of looking for new ways, should we maybe just focus on making the current ones better? But again, the question would be how. So there's the big question. Now it's up to you.
Thank you for the question. I think it's quite interesting, and I was considering at this point when we have seen different decisions taken at the European, but mainly at national level. In my opinion, I think that there is a negative selection of the persons who are in leading position. I'm thinking now from a nationalistic point of view. And I think that the negative selection is quite a habit for about 2 decades in Romanian society. But also at the European level, if we are remembering the votes for the actual European Commission, we have to be correct, and we have to remember that it was the minimum percentage that the actual Commission had for having its mandate. Of course, I think that one of the failure of the actual European Commission is this European Green Deal, that it was launched in 2019 in December, and it is one of my research topics, and that's a topic, and that's why I'm telling that. Because we haven't seen some strategies for Central and Eastern European countries. We haven't seen leaders, national leaders in Romania explaining this concept, or some others idea from the European leadership. We just seen a vision. So this is a perfect example for the unprepared European and national leaders for a very important topic. And now we are questioning again the energy policy, which became the central of the European Green Deal, but nobody is speaking now about the European Green Deal. So I think, yes, the European leadership, yes, the national leadership needs a credibility. And this credibility, of course, is linked with the selection of the leaders, and the decision-making process in Romania especially need to link with the epistemic communities, but also with the business community. Because we are witnessing several decisions in which the Romanian society is not taken into consideration. Of course, if we are thinking about the European leadership, we see a lot of NGOs that are consulting. There are a lot of mechanisms. So the whole engine of this decision making is put into action. But we cannot see it at our national level. So I may see that Romania acceded to the European Union, but in fact didn't integrate. And we can debate on several policies in which we are seeing this. And one very good example is the energy policy and debates in our government decision regarding it. So I think that we need a total switch on the way in which we are selecting a member of the epistemic communities. We need to empower these epistemic communities, but not in the sense of taking the decision like it was in pandemic, but to really participate in the decision-making process, because the political leaders are in fact the persons who will take the decision, and they have to learn to negotiate. Another example, if we are remembering the way in which our government was made, practically 1 day or 2 days of negotiation on different packages or different national policies, I don't think that it's suitable. And we have a very good example from the German politics, in which a lot of politicians are putting on their CVs the fact that they participated into negotiation for a different chapter for the harmonization of different policies. So we need to better select, of course, the member of the epistemic communities and the political parties. I'm speaking now regarding to the Romanian politics. We have to see the departments of the political parties in action. We are not seeing a solution from them. For example, and I'm thinking for the left side, because I think it's a no fact, I'm a leftist. We don't see some solution. We don't see the National Council of the Social Democrats working. I don't see on the right side or center right side the same thing. And if we are speaking in terms of foreign policy, I don't see the difference. Only the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is taking the leading role. So I think it's not good if we are speaking about democracy, or we can debate, of course, on another type of policy. So I think the entire Romanian society will have to take the lead in this. We need more debates, more questions asked on this particular type, and maybe slowly the things will be improved.
Thank you. Before we go to Adam, let me just remind you to prepare questions, have them ready, because we will have about 35 minutes maybe for questions from the audience. Please, Adam.
Yes, thank you very much for the question, which is not a very easy one to provide an answer for. And I'm sure I have no answer, but I can provide some thoughts exactly and reflections. And then just going on from the previous speaker about where we are today, it really is kind of stuck in this situation where we have either this negative selection of leaders, or we have an alternative of technocratic leaders. So we talked about this briefly yesterday, but we do have, I think, a true crisis of leadership in our Western democratic world. And I think, just why I think it's possible we could be in this position, partly is, I think, the fact that our media landscape is very much saturated with dystopian views of the world. Negative emotions, you mentioned feelings, and emotions are what really drive politics, but also drive voters to vote for certain people. And when you have this fear-driven politics, I think this is why we end up with these kind of negative selections, and we're not electing leaders who have a optimistic vision of the future. Instead, we have leaders who are good at diagnosing where the problems are and finding someone to blame for those problems, even though they're not really good at actually solving those problems. And in fact, their whole motivation for being in power is rather less on solving problems, but rather maintaining power and chipping away at the democratic foundations that our societies are built on. And I think we have to realize that, and maybe this goes a little bit to what was said in the last opening remarks about getting hung up on the definition of democracy, as democracy is like a pure concept that if we don't have it, then we have just the opposite. But we should understand really that democracy is more about participation, and it's not just elections. Participation in all parts of society, building a community, and understanding that the interest of the community is connected, and it's not based on just individuals' self-interest. It's actually a larger community and society interest. And in that way, I mean, we can see there are some bright spots, I think, in our societies. If we look at civil society, NGOs, who are doing a lot of the work with fewer resources, at least thinking about Poland, for example. And this is an area where we could probably seek some natural leaders who will be able to mobilize for a positive vision of the future. So I think there are areas, but that maybe political elites should try to open up a bit more instead of focusing on their own also political party as an establishment that is sometimes very difficult to get into, and find new visions. And I think, and just thinking of the Polish example as well, I don't want to steal too many of your thoughts, Wojciech, but if you look at the Polish opposition in Poland, largely their program for the moment is to be anti-government, anti-peace, anti the ruling party. And that's not enough to get elected. This is not what I think societies want to hear. It's not just enough to be anti-peace. I think it has to be a presentation of a new program, a new vision for the future of society. And if you don't have a vision, then it just becomes part of this political fight between one side or the other, very polarized again, which the media also helps, and other forces we can add. And then you have people who become very just frustrated and don't even want to participate in the electoral process, don't want to participate in society because it's very toxic. We can look at some countries which are really struggling with this. For example, in Georgia, has been really struggling in a very polarized situation in the politics there. You can see it's either one side or the other. There's not very much room for a third movement to come in, even though that's exactly what the society wants. And you see such a huge disconnect now between the political elites and the society in Georgia. And this is something that we can also start seeing in some of our societies as well. So I really do think we need to stop the polarization and try to come up with a new vision, try to redefine democracy, redefine our societies, redefine our goals for strengthening society.
Okay, so I can only subscribe to and agree to what Professor Ciot and Adam just said, and I will give you my answer on two levels: the Polish level and let's say global level, which is almost impossible. But I will break the unwritten rule here, at least in my understanding, which is what happens in executive lounge stays in the executive lounge. And yesterday we had this discussion, a couple of us, and I will name those, so don't worry. And we dared each other to name leaders, of the major states nowadays that we would respect, or we respect, and we would like to be under in times of crisis and war. And we struggle to find one name. And I dare you as well, and maybe I missed someone. And I'm talking about mostly major states. I'm not talking about Finland, for example, not because I disrespect Prime Minister, but I think it's just too a small state to actually be considered. So we have a crisis of leadership understood as the kind of major players with both charisma but also kind of intellectual input. And maybe it's because we live in the post-political age, and we are not interested in electing the leaders that really kind of present more. I know that we will, that I'm not talking from my perspective, but from the societal perspective, because I do think that at least in the democratic states, in the Western liberal states, I mean, the elites are just a mirror of the society. If we allow those leaders to be there and frame the debate the way they frame it, it means that we actually are agreeing with that. But is there any solution, from the Polish perspective, from the kind of local perspective? I don't see a quick fix. I only can see the constant but long-term work on the partnership between political parties on one level, NGOs, academia, but that go beyond electoral cycles. It's easy to call someone from academia to become an ambassador or to become a one-person think tank half year before the election. But the question is, do we have the partnership in the long term? Do we take NGOs into the process? Do we have the circulation of elites? Or it's only a club of people? I don't want to go after some of the countries. I don't want to present this, the picture. There is Macron, Scholz, Biden versus, the shirtless Putin riding a horse. Yeah, but because it's a false dichotomy. But in a way, we lack, at least from my perspective, thinkers in the Western world that would give us the spark. But maybe we just don't need them. Maybe we as societies are not interested in those thinkers. That will be my short take on that.
Really, just briefly to add a few points. One is that I think much of politics in democracies has been captured by either partisan ideology or vested interests. And I think both of those never represent popular majorities. They're very minority views. By minorities, I don't mean groups in societies, but I mean particular small sections of society that then, because they're very vocal and influential, capture the political process. And I think both partisan ideologies and vested interests have done a lot of damage, again, corroding confidence in democracy and thereby turning people off it. The other thing that's happened in Western democracies and no doubt elsewhere is that politics has become increasingly a spectacle. Yeah, it's become some sort of show for sort of competing personalities. And the trouble with that is that politics isn't the same as entertainment or reality TV, and shouldn't be, and that people never ever want the copy, they want the original. So if somehow politicians think by making it more like entertainment, people are going to be switched on and interested. In fact, it's just the opposite. Citizens don't want to see that. If they want to watch reality TV, they'll watch the real thing. And this is where I think a lot of politicians have gone wrong, sort of trying to be, showing some kind of popular touch. I think it's actually doing just the opposite. People find it off-putting, if not worse. That isn't to say that all politics has to be entirely sort of serious or purely technocratic in a way that would be tedious, but it has to be, it has to engage people at their most important concerns, and also at the level of norms and values that speak to people. Neither being lectured by their politicians, nor sort of, politicians stooping to the lowest level, just to kind of show that they understand the common man and the common woman. I don't think that's what citizens want. They want, I think, virtuous, enlightened leadership. They want people to recognize the problem, come to a judgment of what should be done, and do it. And I think that would be the way for politics and politicians to regain some of the confidence and trust that I think have so evidently lost. But all of that, again, presupposes that our politics is truly representative and participatory. So we have to have, candidates that represent society in a far better way than is currently the case. I think we have drawn politicians from very, very narrow groups in society. In the West, it's often the sort of professional managerial class, people who've got no experience of anything outside of politics. They've never done any other job. They have only ever studied, PPE at Oxford in the case of the UK. And I won't tell you what PPE stands for. You might think it stands for philosophy, politics, and economics. I can tell you that most people think it stands for something else, but I won't use those words here. But you could say pretty poor education, and you wouldn't be very wrong. And increasingly, whether you look at the US or elsewhere, people are drawn from either particular forms of law or particular forms of business, but not a wide range of professions and, if you like, life experience. Not to mention that a lot of working class candidates have been systematically eliminated from the political process. And are we then surprised that a section of the working class turns away from politics altogether or votes for very populist candidates. I mean, I think that is another development that's been really pernicious. And then we need more participation as well. I totally agree. Democracy isn't just about voting every 3, 4, 5 years. And then in the meantime, essentially being on the receiving end of decisions that are taken. It is about, partaking, sharing in the common life that is being built. Because democracy is about building a common life where differences can coexist peacefully, but where some decisions are taken, right? And some things are being done that couldn't be done by people themselves. So we need more democracy at the workplace, more democracy where people live, a much more democratic management of common assets and resources. But we also need a political representative system that really can act in the national interest and together with international partners, act on shared interests. And if we don't have that, then I think people will think that the alternative will be much more something like authoritarian or even military rule. And we mustn't think that is in the past. I think that is a threat that remains. And whilst I'm neither an optimist nor pessimist, at this point I would say I'm not optimistic that it will happen, but I remain hopeful that it can happen.
Thank you. Yes, more food for thought, but I'll refrain from expressing other opinions now so that I can give some room to your questions. So, Leon? Should we maybe take the other question as well? And okay, so let's have 3 questions asked now, and then we can have a round of answers, and then maybe we'll have some more time for. Thank you. Thank you. So I would suggest you address both the individual questions and the collective questions as you go along. And we have about 15-20 more minutes. So maybe we will have time for another synthetic question at the end, if anybody wants to prepare one. Who wants to? Maybe you can start, since I think you got most questions.
I'm sure I don't have most the answers, but I will try to address Leon's questions first about the populism of the ruling party in the, let's say, 1 year span of time, because that's your question. So, when I titled the talk "Saved by War," of course, it's a kind of a risky title, because I do think that in the short term, they got saved, but in a 1 year time, they might become a victim of their own success, or actually, that they, of course, no one wished for the war, but some of the byproducts of war might actually mean that they will lose power. So I expect that they will, crank up populism as much as they can for the sake of the electoral campaign. I'll just wait because Pavel is leaving. No, now everyone knows. Too late. Take care. Safe travels. And I do think that's fine. Because of this populism, they might find themselves in a very dangerous spot, because they might actually undermine the very fragile solidarity. I'm talking about foreign policy right now, that is still somewhere in the NATO corridors. But if they start to poke the EU too much with the anti-EU rhetoric, which, like say, is kind of strange, because if you look into the society, and that comes more now towards the second question about the church and the state. Actually, right now, Polish society is not anti-EU. It's predominantly for EU. So it's a very strange phenomenon that the political elite, the ruling party, is using this stick, almost like a reminder. And coming back to the state-church debate, and I'm not an expert on Catholic Church in Poland, and there are at least 8 people from Poland here who probably know more about it. So I'm not the best to address it, but I would argue that in a way, back in a day, Church could not say no to the EU because there was too much of the popular willing to enter EU, although Church understood that it's also a threat with the, let's say, call it European values that are not necessarily the ones that 20 years ago were quite prominent in Polish traditional society. So in that way, there was there was this conflict, and to address, excuse me, one of Joanna's takes on values and on the EU, in the context of European Union. My reading of this is that still in Poland, after 18 years of being full member of the European Union, many people don't know what EU is for. And that's problem of the EU itself, part of the government, part of the civic society. If we hear even debates from the serious scholars, we very often hear this we versus them division, like we are in the EU, but actually we are kind of, outside. But we are not the island, we are not UK. We cannot afford to have this discourse. So I think that, there's one of those problems that we have in this values debate, what the EU means for us, for us, not only as Polish, but also for, Europeans. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for the questions. And maybe I'll start just to add on what Wojciech was saying about your skepticism in Poland, because I came across a poll, a public opinion poll from, I think, June, and it's that 89% of Poles have a positive view of the European Union, which is the highest rating since they started taking this. I think it's the Eurobarometer since 2007. in this survey. So, Poles actually have a very positive view of the European Union, even if they don't understand what it is. I think that for the government, the ruling party, the question is whether they're able to frame the Euroscepticism in the same way that Viktor Orban has been able to do in Hungary, not being anti-EU as such, but it's those bastards in Brussels who are out to get us, and we need to stand up for ourselves. And that's a kind of a different type of Euroscepticism, but at the same time, it does wear away on this belief, in particularly in terms of solidarity, European solidarity. When we're being attacked from the inside, we have to first defend ourselves against Brussels. To Leon's question about what's in the region where we could see some issues, I think what I'm watching right now, I think we do see some instability in politics, and looking particularly what happened in Prague this last weekend with a huge demonstration against the government support for Ukraine. I think something like 70,000 people came out. And this is quite worrying because they're demanding that the government, minimizes its support, ease the sanctions so that the crisis doesn't hit them so much, energy in particular. And Slovakia as well. I'm just reading now about some instability in Slovakia, and here we have two governments which were elected against the populists, but in order to have to be able to have a government against the populists, you have a broad coalition. And a lot of times this coalition doesn't see eye to eye on a lot of issues, and we see in Slovakia that this coalition possibly could collapse, which would leave opening for, I would guess, probably Fico to come back in power, for example. And that's in the region inside the EU, but I think we should really be watching, in particular, some other countries in the neighborhood. If we are thinking about, especially if we think about the crises that are coming, this is what I was trying to say in my opening remarks, that these crises will push societies to, in some way, and I do think that there is, disinformation activities will play a strong role here as well, to stop support for Ukraine, because that narrative of the support for Ukraine is the reason why we have these crises, I think will be what is going to be pushed a lot into these societies. And that means less support for NATO, and that gives openings to Russia and other countries in the region. So for Romania, for example, Moldova, I think we have to really keep a close eye on what is happening in Moldova. It's a very, it has a potential to be explosive. Whether or not Russia has the ability to try to open a front in Transnistria, for example, I think is another question. And Ukraine, of all countries, has already announced that it would support Moldova militarily if there was a front opened in Moldova, since we know that Moldova's defense forces are not that adequate. And then we have to keep Belarus in mind. I mean, Belarus has, since February. Think about 2 years ago. It was just 2 years ago when the Belarusians took to the streets to protest the fake election of Lukashenko, who was still in power, and the repressions that followed. I mean, these are repressions on the scale of North Korea, and we are just kind of standing by letting it happen. And as those repressions were happening, and the war broke out in Ukraine, Lukashenko has effectively, de facto, given its sovereignty away to Russia. And the Belarusian people right now, especially those who want to be free and have no opportunity to even express it, are really in a very difficult situation. And I mean, from the Polish perspective, security perspective, we have a border with Belarus, and it can be also a very important security standpoint for Poland. And we can even just look at last summer which is still continuing too, this kind of hybrid attack of the Belarusian regime, importing migrants from the Middle East to Minsk and then pushing them to the Polish border, caused a lot of problems. This is a topic we have not discussed here at all, but it also divided Polish society because the Polish government response was quite harsh, disregarding human rights of those poor people who were just instruments in geopolitics. So I think those are some of the main things that I'm watching right at the moment.
Well, thank you very much for the excellent question. So, on the first point about what do we have in terms of democratic theory? I mean, there are lots of names you mentioned, which are still very valuable resources, especially when we think about what Bernard Crick in his book In Defense of Politics calls the conciliation of interests. That if you really want to bring about a politics that commands majority support, you have to think about how to reconcile the strange interests. Capital and labor, young and old. Various geographical divides, educational divides, and so on. So I think that there are lots and lots of good resources. But I also think we do have to bear in mind some of the classical writings from antiquity, from the Middle Ages, and from early modernity. I mean, Plato, Aristotle have still a lot to teach us because they are also talking about fundamentals like notions of the good. How can we identify and pursue goods that are internal to human activities? How to be a good citizen, a good parent, a good colleague. These things aren't somehow just private matters. They're also important for democracy. How can we produce a better class of political leaders and representatives, but also an electorate that isn't going to be manipulated by the media or by demagogues, but actually can make up its mind. So how do we instill virtue? And I also think some of the writings by Alexis de Tocqueville are still important because one of the things he points out, in the case of America, but I think that can be generalized, is paradoxically, a democracy needs non-democratic elements in order to work. And what are these non-democratic elements, which are not anti-democratic? They just don't follow a logic of majoritarian votes or decisions. Those elements are, on the one hand, some form of monarchical authority. That means there will be someone who has to make a decision. So whether it's an elected president or a constitutional monarch or whatever constitutional model you follow, you can't have a democracy that doesn't also have someone who makes an ultimate decision. And this is not a Schmittian argument about being a sovereign who has to step outside, the framework of legality or legitimacy. Not at all. But it has to be the sense that there is a person who is ultimately responsible and also ultimately accountable. Right? So I think that's really vital. But there's also another element, which is essentially forms of aristocracy, because you can't eliminate them. If we think that by getting rid of the hereditary aristocracy, we solved all of our problems of feudalism, well, we're very mistaken, because new forms of aristocracy develop, and you can have better or worse forms. You can have an aristocracy of virtue that actually leads by example, or you can have a really corrupt aristocracy turned oligarchic, which again we see all around us. So the question is, how can you have better elites? And elites are not groups that inherit power in some sort of rigid way, but actually they're just the leaders at every level of society, in education, in business, in the churches, in the trade unions, everywhere. And it's how we cultivate, better forms of leadership, as we've said all along. So democracy paradoxically needs monarchy and aristocracy, but not despotism, not a kind of absolute monarch, nor a corrupt oligarchy. It needs good forms of aristocratic and monarchical elements. Without that, it won't work. And that's true for an elected president in France or the United States as much as for a prime minister within the UK system of a constitutional monarchy. And even the monarchy is, I'm afraid, going much too far the way of popular entertainment. The royals want to be like us. Well, actually, they shouldn't be like us. That's the whole point of having a monarchy. If they are like us, then people will say, well, I don't want a monarch who looks like a pop star. I prefer the pop star. And then we'll get rid of the monarchy, and then we will have lost something quite valuable. Right? So the monarchy, of course, has to understand what people care about, but it shouldn't emulate the worst aspects of popular culture. I think that's a huge mistake, and you can see that in the case of Harry and Meghan. I'm afraid that's not going to command support and respect over time.
Just to give an answer to the collective questions, if I'm remembering correctly, the essence of the question of our colleague the business community involvement. The negotiation is the lifeblood of the European Union, and in the decision triangle, the procedure and mechanisms involve the market structures in the decision-making process. But I don't think that the political leaders, the political parties will invite all the time the market structure. So it is in their hands to act and to self-determine their involvement. And for example, if they want an improvement in the legislation, there are a lot of power mechanisms in which they could act. For example, at national level, we have this Economic and Social Committee, which gives the approval for all the modification or for all the new laws that appear, but also there are a lot of forums, and of course, if I'm remembering correctly from the decision-making process at national level that I took part, there is also a mechanism for an annually or biannually consultation with this representation of the market structures. But of course, it is very hard to ask from this structure, from the business community, a permanent involvement. If they have a specific interest on a specific field, they will act. If not, they won't act based on the solidarity or from moral commitment, let's say, principle. But I think it is a behavior that we are still learning. We are just learning this for about 30 years, from 1989. So I think that this behavior will be learned and will be improved if this national market structure will be part of the European networks, and I hope that they will learn from the power of example. And also, you were speaking about the open markets, about the solidarity. European Union has a different circles, even we are not in favor of it. We have the Eurozone, we have the Schengen area. So when we begin and when the Romanian society agreed with this accession process, when we engage in this transformation process of the entire society, we knew that we will have these different circles of decision. Of course, we have contributors and the beneficiaries from the European budget. So it is up to us to fight all the time for our national interest. There is a lot of negotiation into the laboratories, into the corridors of the European institutions. So it's up of each member state to fight for their rights. Some of the states are better fighters and some are just raising their hand. Of course, we can say that the Central and Eastern European member states, because they are new, they don't have access to the old member states, but it's up to us to send credible politicians, because if we will have a political elite based on the professional competence, based on their actions, not just talking into electoral fights, maybe these doors of the European institutions will open largely to Romania also, because this is a national, I think, debate into our Romanian society, why Romania doesn't have a place at the table of the decision. Because of the credibility of the political leaders, I may put an answer on the table. So, thank you.
And let's not forget that we are in a country where the level of trust from the public in the fundamental institutions of representative democracy, which is political parties and the parliament, is below 10% usually, yes. Right? Which is the lowest ever, whereas the army, church, which are all important and have their own role, are 60, 70 or in that area. As you can hear from the church, it's already 12. But if anybody has any dying question, we did start 5 minutes late, so I'm sure Leon can allow for for an extra 5 minutes, even though I assume we are all somewhat tired and maybe a bit hungry as well. So if nobody has any question left, let me just and I have the privilege of taking the extra 5 minutes then, even less than that. One thing that comes to my mind whenever we are to talk about democracy and what is the state of democracy, you know, all these debates that we had even now in the last 2 hours. There's a thing that comes to my mind, and I'm actually very happy it was brought up because I don't have to state it myself. The fact that this is no time for how shall I put it, for relativity, right? So there's much debate that we can have about how we can improve democracy or how we can fight the wrongs that threaten democracy. But at the same time, we are living an age, and again, I think this is even before the war in Ukraine, where we do have to make a stand in favor of democracy, because there is so much energy that goes into corroding the basics of democracy, and I do not see an effort, a counter effort with an equal amount of energy invested in preserving it. So I think this is a proper time to take sides, and a personal experience I had, which I think is quite telling, and this is not about Russian propaganda or populists that are outright against or anti-democratic. It's maybe, let me borrow your expression about the useful idiots, because that was right in the beginning, and I think that was useful in itself. About a year ago, actually a bit more than that. So when our previous government was starting to fall, when USR was getting out of the government, I was invited in a radio talk show to have my own comment about that, with local journalists that my colleagues in Cluj, I'm sure, know, but I will not name now. And he kept telling me that such behavior from politicians is not a democracy. This is not, and it was very, and this was like local but public radio in prime time. And people were listening. I don't know if tens of people or hundreds of people, but nevertheless, people were listening. And this is a respected voice in local journalism. And he was very adamant in saying that this is not a democracy. Romania is not a democracy. It's no longer a democracy. And we got into a whole different topic. And I was asking, what is then a democracy to you? Because I think this is a democracy. And as Adrian said, if people willingly leave government, you can have a point about that, an opinion about it. But nevertheless, they do so willingly. To me, that is a democracy. And he said that his own definition is that a democracy is a type of regime, which I disagree, but I found quite interesting, a type of regime where everybody gets to live a good life. It's like, okay, but what is a good life? And good to you, good to me, we don't have time then and now, literally. But nevertheless, my point is that the views in the minds of the public, even elites that come from the public, when it comes to how democracy should look like, the views are so fuzzy, yet there is so much energy in fighting democracy, maybe coming still from a minority of the public, but nevertheless it's there. And I think, discussions like this, debates like this, we have the privilege of being able to have them. But I think it's key that we take this outside setups like this one, and try to make this point in whatever small discussions we have over beer or lunch or whatever with people around us, because this is, I think, how such ideas can, or in a radio talk show or in other events, this is how such ideas, which are, again, critical but favorable, nevertheless, of democracy, can ultimately prevail. So thank you very much. Thank you to all 4 speakers. If you want to have another round of applause, I will not stop you.